This is a copy of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on Sunday, the 13th of October. And just to note, it's based on the book of 2 Kings, chapters 22 and 23. I'll actually be reading some of those verses as we go through. I'm going to start by reading verses 1 to 7 of chapter 22. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adaiah. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary Shaphan, son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrust it to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple, but they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they are honest in their dealings." Last week we heard about Manasseh, the king in Judea, who dragged Judah into the worst state of godlessness and immorality the nation had ever seen. We now jump forward 20 years to the reign of Josiah. And if you think back to our own nation, you'll know that in 20 years quite a lot can change. In 2004, you heard this noise every time you wanted to access the internet. Beep, boop, 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 beep, boop. In 2004, people who owned phones like this were thought of as cool. In 2004, Man City just managed to avoid relegation. In 2004, Jimmy Savile was a public icon, loved by all. So much can change in 20 years. So let's do a tour of Judah 20 years after Manasseh and see just how much has changed. First stop on our tour of Judah is King Josiah. Who was King Josiah best friends with? Hilkiah, the high priest. Josiah actually wanted the high priest's help him live a godly life. What a change from the days of Manasseh. The next stop on our tour of Judah is the doorkeepers and the temple supervisors. They handled the money that helped maintain the temple. And we learn in these verses that these two groups of people were honest. They actually saw the rebuilding of the temple as something important. What a change from 20 years ago. The next stop on our tour of Judah is the builders, the people who did the actual physical graft rebuilding the temple. What do we find these builders doing on our tour? They're not eating donuts. Just think, when was the last time you saw a builder actually doing work? Yet these builders actually had hammers, not donuts, in their hands. And with its new coat of golden paint, the temple showed all the outward signs that things were improving. What a change from 20 years ago in the days of Manasseh, when things only went from bad to worse. In 20 years, so much can change. Just think about it. 20 years ago, Sunderland were in the Championship. And just think where they are now. Okay, not everything changes in 20 years. Even after a long time, some problems remain the same. And sadly, what was true for Sunderland Football Club was true for Judea. Let's do a 180 turn and we trace our steps through the nation of Judea. On your left, we've got the Temple of God. On the outside, it looks pretty good with its new coat of paint. But in chapter 23, Josiah discovers male cult prostitutes inside the temple, and he discovers items used in the worship of the false gods Baal and Asherah. These items were in God's house. These things were going on, but the people couldn't see how wrong they were. Next step on our tour, on our right is the beautiful hills of Judea. Beautiful, green, and a sight to see. But when Josiah looked more closely, he discovered the black ashes of the children burned alive in idol worship. For 20 years, this moral, religious, hard-working group of people had lived in blissful ignorance, thinking that everything was okay. They lived in such ignorance of their own moral corruption that they even named a hill the Hill of Corruption, and no one batted an eyelid. How blind do you have to be to call something that name, the Hill of Corruption? Now, before I move on, it's important we remind ourselves of this, the title of today's sermon. The title of today's sermon is The Three Truths, the three truths that will save you. Not the three truths that could save your immoral neighbour Bob. Not the three truths that this unchristian nation really need to learn, but the three truths that will save you. The first truth that will save you is this: you and I just might not be as good as we think. If there is anything this passage teaches us, it is that humans can be very blind to their own sin. We can even live a lifetime not even seeing the half of it. But, hang on a second. News just in. I've just been informed that there is an exception. I have just been informed that I have been awarded the title of the best person in the world. I must say, I'm a little overcome. There are so many people to thank for this award that I am the best person in the world. Firstly, I'd like to thank my long-term friend, Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, thank you for teaching me everything you know about acting. Thank you for showing me how to convince people I am better than I am. And Perspective, thank you, Perspective. You always taught me to put myself in other people's shoes. And the day I stood in those 6-inch stilettos, I found it so much easier to look down on other people. Conscience, how could I forget about you? But then you, Conscience, told me how important it was that I do forget about you. If I had not forgotten about you, I would have never done some of the things I've done and feel so good about them afterwards. And of course, excuses. Thank you, excuses. You were always there when I needed you. Pride. When I fell down flat on my face, you were right there beside me. You were right there beside me, hitting me on the head with that mallet. Now, thanks to the amnesia, I have perfect eyesight. I can clearly see other people's mistakes, but cannot remember my own. Thank you, all of you. Hypocrisy, excuses, pride, and always forgetting Conscience. Thank you for helping me achieve the status of the best person in the world. Now, I know that was just a bit of silliness, but it just shows how easy it is to take a guided tour through our last week and discover nothing objectionable. We've all got ways of convincing ourselves that we're better than we are. Likewise, if you read verses 1 to 7, the guided tour of Judea in the first 18 years of Josiah's reign, if you read verses 1 to 7, you'll discover nothing objectionable. This was a group of moral, religious, and hard-working people, the best nation in the Middle East, so different from every nation around them. But then, the light got turned on in verse 8. Reading from verse 8 of chapter 22. Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. Then Shaphan, the secretary, went to the king and reported to him, Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord, and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple. Then Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. Everyone knows that the most effective way to eliminate poverty is not charity, it's not aid, it's not greater government involvement. The most effective way to eliminate poverty is to close your eyes. When you can't see a problem, there is nothing to fix. For 18 years, Josiah couldn't see the nation's spiritual poverty. He couldn't see the wrong things were going on. He couldn't see how desperately in need of God's forgiveness the people were. But the moment the lamp went on, the moment he discovered God's law, the moment the nation saw how far short of the standard they'd fallen, when Josiah's eyes were opened, he saw how spiritually bankrupt the nation was, and how desperately he and they needed God's forgiveness. And so, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. The first truth that will save you is this: you might not be as good as you think. But how? How can this truth save me? You know, some of you may have heard multiple sermons answering that question before. You know what to do about the sins you've committed. Towards the end, I'll go over God's answer to that question, just to remind us all. But for now, I want to stress that this truth is not something you simply realize early on as a Christian, do something about way back then, and then move on. The truth you might not be as good as you think is a truth that can save you now. Take note of Josiah's actions in chapter 23. Chapter 23 lists what Josiah did when he realized how idolatrous the nation was. Take note of what Josiah did. Josiah brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and beat it to dust, and cast the dust out upon the graves of the common people. Josiah burned the Asherah poles, the image of the idols they worshipped. Now surely no one is going to rescue their burnt remnants from the fire and start worshipping them all over again. But because Josiah knew that he and the people were sinners, he knew that no sin was beyond them. And so he not only burned them, he ground the burnt remnants into powder, and then threw the powder onto Israel's graves. In those days, Jews didn't visit graveyards like we do. Josiah knew that it would never cross the people's mind to touch a gravestone. But Josiah knew it would cross people's mind to return to their past sins. And so, because Josiah believed this, because Josiah believed no one was as good as they think, Josiah believed no sin was beyond them. and this caused him to put sin as far from the people's grasp as he could. Not only did Josiah believe that no sin was beyond other people, Josiah believed no sin was beyond him. In chapter 23, verse 8, we read, Josiah broke down the high places, the places where idols were worshipped. Josiah broke down the high places that were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on one's left at the gate of the city. I don't know if you remember one of the first facts that we learn about Josiah in chapter 22, verse 2. In this verse we learn that Josiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Josiah was so godly, he is described as never straying from God's path, neither to the right or to the left. And yet, when Josiah walked into the city, he didn't look left and say to himself, that altar on my left, I'm never going to go astray and worship that. That sin is so beyond me. No, Josiah never strayed from God's path, neither to the right or the left, because he realized how at risk he was from going astray. He saw temptation, and he did everything he could to avoid it. Verse 15. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place, made by Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. Now just some geography for you. Josiah was the king of southern Judah. The idol that Jeroboam built was in northern Israel. This idol was beyond the border in Israel. Surely this sin was beyond the people of Judea. But even the altar at Bethel, even that altar and high place, Josiah demolished. The truth, you might not be as good as you think. This truth can not only save you from the sins you've done in the past by putting your faith in Jesus. This truth can save you from all sorts of sins that you might do in the future. It will cause you to realize that no sin is beyond you. And when you truly believe no sin is beyond you, you'll follow Josiah's example and fight against sin with the intensity it deserves. Chapter 22, 11, verse 15. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people, and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says." Josiah was the king, the highest authority in the land. But did you notice who Josiah was willing to listen to for advice? The granddaughter of the keeper of the wardrobe, a servant. The wife of Shallum, a woman, a servant woman. I don't know about you, but I cannot bring myself to take advice from anyone I consider under me. It really gets under my skin when students or unqualified people tell me what to do. And yet Josiah was humble enough to listen to this servant girl, this woman, which for a king in his day was revolutionary. Why did Josiah do this? Because he acknowledged that there was a higher authority than him. Reading chapter 23. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees, with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. Josiah knew that no one was exempt from being under God's authority. He was willing to take on board whatever God said. Josiah's actions were revolutionary for his day. Josiah's actions would be even more revolutionary in our day. We live in a society that typically objects to the idea of authority. Our society objects to anyone telling us how to live our lives. For example, the British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC. The BBFC is the agency that says if a film is a U or a PG or a PG-13, a 15 or an 18. Or it even says if a film contains content that is so unsuitable that it's X-rated and cannot be shown. The BBFC used to decide what they thought was and what wasn't suitable for each age group to watch. Now they send out questionnaires asking people, what do you think is suitable for you to watch? And then they classify the films based on what the people think is right for them. The new slogan of the BBFC is, view what's right for you. I'm not here to debate whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, but it just reflects a growing trend in our society. People are free to decide what is right for themselves. No one has the right to tell me how to live. Choose your own gender. Choose your own sexual partner. Choose your own sexual ethics. Choose your own date of death. These are some of the big headline examples. Be true to yourself. Decide your own truth, as long as it makes you happy. These are all things our culture celebrates. But would you really celebrate if there was no higher authority? Would you celebrate with a fillet of fish at Jasmine's new restaurant, the salmon called Ella? Would you celebrate at that restaurant if there was no food standards agency? No food standard agency to tell the salmon called Ella, Salmonella for short. If there was no food standard agency to tell Salmonella what is and isn't good and right, would you want to eat in that restaurant? Would you celebrate if the philosophy, as long as it makes you happy? Would you celebrate if that philosophy was taught by the Taliban to their latest military students? As long as it makes you happy, shoot that person, wear that vest. How many pieces of chicken would you eat from your KFC bucket if everyone was free to decide what they class as meat? Ask me why Kentucky Fried Chicken had to change to being called KFC, because its chicken couldn't technically be called chicken. That's a story in the history books. It's not true now, but it was true in the past. Going back to our first example, if there was no higher authority, no food standard agency, we'd all be at risk of being poisoned, for not everyone shares the same standards. And do you know what the most effective way to poison a large number of people is? How effective would I be if I tried to poison everyone in my church with Marmite sandwiches? Maybe I might poison half of them, but probably not all. The most effective way to poison everyone is to give everyone what they want. The most effective way to poison a nation is to let everyone do what is right in their own eyes. No higher authority. Everyone free to decide for themselves. This philosophy had been poisoning the nation of Israel for years. The reason the nation was saved was because Josiah accepted the following truth. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah, the high priest. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found, because we have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. God is over us. God has spoken to us. We've rejected his authority over us, and we've chosen to live our own way. This was the truth that saved Josiah, because that is what led him to call upon God for grace and mercy and forgiveness. So the two truths that will save you and I might not be as good as we think. The second is recognizing that God has authority over us. He is the standard of right and wrong. But finally, the third and most wonderful truth of them all. Reading from chapter 23, verse 21. The king gave this order to all the people. Celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. Neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, had any such Passover been observed. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. This upbeat ending, this celebration, is quite a tonal shift from everything that has gone before. In fact, you might have found some of the things said in this sermon so far difficult to hear. The tone so far has not been the most upbeat. And we don't like to feel downbeat about ourselves, that we're not as good as we think. We much prefer to be told upbeat things like, you're pretty or you're handsome. We much prefer to be told these things than, you're ugly. I don't believe anyone is ugly, but I do sympathise with the way our society demands that women prove that they're pretty. To be seen as pretty, women are taught that they must use a bottle of foundation, a bottle of blusher, a bottle of eyeshadow, a bottle of mascara, a bottle of lipstick, a bottle of hair dye, a bottle of nail varnish. Whereas for a man to think that he's handsome, he simply needs 5 bottles of Guinness and a mirror. Now, I don't know how much you do or don't identify with these gender stereotypes, but you may identify with one of these 2 methods of being seen as a good person. Method number 1, the 5 pints of Guinness method. Forget about standards, lower them. Instead of thinking and seeing clearly, have a distorted view of everything. Have a distorted view of what is good and what is right. There is the irreligious version of this. Everyone's free to decide what is right for themselves, so go ahead and do whatever you like. There is a religious version of this. The Pharisees thought they were good because they reduced goodness to an outward set of rules. Because they kept these rules, they thought they looked handsome in a religious sense, even though what was below the surface was ugly. Method 1, the 5 pints of Guinness method. Method 2, the 10 million bottles of beauty products you must apply every day method. This method relies on you doing things to make you feel better about yourself, to look better in the eyes of other people, to look better and acceptable in God's sight. All you need to do is do more good things. Have at least one person say, "Aren't you such a good person?" every day. Try harder to do more good things than you did yesterday. This method is hard work. Harder work than applying 10 million beauty products every morning. If you can relate to this method, here's the truth that will save you. God saves us. We don't save ourselves. Josiah ended his day not listing all the things the Judeans needed to do to be saved. Josiah ended his day reminding them of that time when God had done everything needed to save them. Josiah called the people to celebrate the Passover, the Passover being a reminder of how God had saved the Jews from Egypt. A lamb had been slaughtered. They applied this blood to the door frames of their houses. And when God's angel passed over, bearing God's judgment, they were saved from that judgment by the blood of the lamb. This is the truth that saved them. God saved them. They did not save themselves. It is essential you understand this truth if you wish to be saved as well. A lamb has been slaughtered. Jesus was described as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. A lamb has been slaughtered. Apply this truth to your life. Trust that He, Jesus, died on the cross to take your sin, bearing God's judgment on your behalf. This is the only truth that will save you eternally. And in an earthly sense, it will also save you as well. It will save you from that endless list of things you tell yourself you must do every morning. It can be soul-destroying to believe that only if you do these things will God accept you. Will you feel like you're acceptable in His sight? Let this wonderful truth sink in instead. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free from accusation. God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God.